The North Atlantic in February 1943 was a graveyard waiting to happen. Captain James Morrison knew this as he stood on the bridge of HMS Steadfast, leading a convoy of 17 merchant ships through waters so cold they could kill a man in under 4 minutes. The convoy, designated HX 229 Amperes, carried supplies that could turn the tide of the war: ammunition, aircraft parts, fuel oil, and grain to feed a starving Britain. But tonight, Morrison's eyes weren't on the dark water, or the barely visible silhouettes of the cargo ships scattered across the black Atlantic. Tonight, his gaze was fixed on something that shouldn't have been there at all: a lighthouse. "Sir," First Officer Davies approached, his voice tight with confusion. "That's Fastnet Rock, isn't it?" But the Admiralty said all coastal lights were extinguished months ago. Morrison lowered his binoculars, feeling ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the February wind. Davies was right. Every lighthouse along the British and Irish coasts had been dark since 1940, a security measure to prevent German submarines from using them for navigation. Yet there it was, sweeping its beam across the water with mechanical precision, a brilliant white finger pointing directly at their convoy. "It can't be Fastnet," Morrison muttered. "We're 60 miles too far west." He raised the binoculars again, his hands beginning to tremble. Someone's lit a light where no light should be. The beam rotated again, and this time Morrison saw something that made his blood run cold. The light wasn't sweeping in a normal lighthouse pattern. It was flashing 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short, Morse code, SOS. But the lighthouse wasn't calling for help. It was marking them. "Hard to starboard," Morrison's voice cracked across the bridge. "Signal all ships evasive maneuvers. Pattern Delta. Kill all running lights. Now!" The helmsman spun the wheel. But Morrison knew they were too late. In the inky water below, eyes that had been watching the mysterious lighthouse now turned toward the convoy. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann peered through the periscope of U-boat 437, a thin smile spreading across his face. "Danke schön, my British friend," he whispered to no one. "Right on schedule." The first torpedo hit the SS Margaret Eyre, amidships at 2:17 hours. The explosion tore through the darkness like a miniature sun, illuminating the faces of men who would be dead within the hour. The ship, carrying 10,000 tons of aviation fuel, became an inferno that spread across the water, turning the North Atlantic into a lake of fire. Morrison watched in horror as 2 more ships, the Celtic Princess and the Harrogate, took hits in rapid succession. The sea erupted in geysers of flame and water as the wolf pack, perfectly positioned by that impossible lighthouse, began their killing spree. "Get me a bearing on that light," Morrison roared. "I want to know exactly where it is." But even as his crew scrambled to triangulate the position, Morrison felt a deeper dread settling over him. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a lucky U-boat captain stumbling upon a convoy. This was a trap, and someone had deliberately guided them into it. The lighthouse continued its steady rotation, its beam now illuminating the burning wrecks and the tiny lifeboats scattered across the killing ground. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light went dark. In the chaos that followed the screaming, the burning oil, the desperate rescue attempts, no one on the HMS Steadfast noticed the small figure standing in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, watching through a window as the convoy died. The figure raised a hand to their mouth, and in the darkness, no one could see if it was trembling with fear or satisfaction. By dawn, 12 ships lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Over 300 men were dead. And in the Admiralty's offices in London, when the coded message from Captain Morrison arrived, 3 words would launch the most disturbing investigation of the war. The lighthouse was lit. But the lighthouse they would find, when they finally reached those coordinates the next day, had been abandoned for 18 months. The lamps were cold. The oil reservoirs were bone dry. The logbook showed the last entry dated the 14th of July, 1941. According to every record, no light had burned there since the keeper, a man named Thomas Pemberton, had been evacuated when the war began. Yet 312 men were dead, and someone had shown the wolves exactly where to strike. Part 2. The Keeper's Secret. Commander Elizabeth Ashford of Naval Intelligence stood in the lighthouse keeper's cottage 3 days after the massacre, breathing in the smell of salt, mildew, and something else. Something that made her skin crawl. Fresh tobacco smoke. "Someone's been here," she said, running her finger along the windowsill. "Recently." Lieutenant Peter Walsh, her assistant, held up an oil lamp. "The wicks are trimmed, ma'am, and there's fresh oil in this can. Military grade, by the smell of it." Ashford moved to the lighthouse's logbook, the one that supposedly hadn't been touched since July 1941. She opened it carefully, her trained eyes scanning the entries. Thomas Pemberton's handwriting was neat, methodical, the entries of a man who took his duty seriously. Weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance notes. Then she saw it, a barely perceptible change in the ink color on what should have been the final page. "Get me a magnifying glass," she ordered. Under magnification, the truth revealed itself. Someone had added entries to this logbook, forged entries designed to make it look like the lighthouse had been properly decommissioned. But the forger had made one critical mistake. They'd used slightly different ink, and the paper showed microscopic indentations that didn't match Pemberton's writing pressure. "Find Thomas Pemberton," Ashford said quietly. "I don't care if you have to drag him out of whatever pub he's drinking himself to death in. I need to speak with him. Today." But finding Thomas Pemberton proved impossible. According to official records, he'd been relocated to a cottage in Cornwall after the lighthouse was decommissioned. When Walsh's team arrived at the address, they found an elderly woman who'd been living there for 2 years. She'd never heard of any lighthouse keeper named Pemberton. The Admiralty personnel file told them that Pemberton was 54 years old, unmarried, had served as keeper of Street Kieran's Light for 12 years. But when Ashford dug deeper, the inconsistencies multiplied like cancer cells. Pemberton's national identity card had been issued in 1940, unusual for a man who should have had one since 1939. His birth certificate, when they finally tracked it down, belonged to a Thomas Pemberton who had died of influenza in 1919, age 7. "He's a ghost," Walsh breathed. "The man never existed." "Oh, he existed," Ashford corrected, staring at the lighthouse keeper's photograph, a grainy image of a stern-faced man with deep-set eyes. "But Thomas Pemberton isn't his real name." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A fisherman named Colum O'Malley, who'd supplied the lighthouse with provisions before the war, came forward after hearing about the investigation. He sat in the interrogation room, twisting his cap in weathered hands. "I always thought there was something odd about him," O'Malley said. "The way he spoke, you know? His accent was all wrong for a Cornishman. Sometimes, late at night when I deliver supplies, I'd hear him talking to himself. But it wasn't English he was speaking." "What was it?" Ashford leaned forward. "German, ma'am. I served in the First War. I know the sound of it." The room went silent. "There's more," O'Malley continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "About 2 months before the war started, I saw a boat come in at night. Small motor launch, no lights. 2 men got off and went into the lighthouse. They stayed 3 hours. When they left, Pemberton, or whatever his name was, he was different, nervous, kept looking over his shoulder." Ashford felt the pieces clicking into place, each one more disturbing than the last. "Did you see what the men looked like?" "One of them, yes. Tall fellow, blonde hair, had a scar here." O'Malley drew a line down his left cheek. "The other stayed in the shadows. But I heard them arguing, just for a moment. The one with the scar called the other one Hauptmann, captain, a German military rank." That night, Ashford sent an urgent cable to MI5's German intelligence section. The response came back within hours, and when she read it, she had to sit down. The description matched Wilhelm Brandt, a German Abwehr agent who'd been operating in Britain since 1937. He was a ghost, a legend in intelligence circles, the man who'd supposedly infiltrated the Royal Navy itself. MI5 had been hunting him for 6 years without success. But it was the second part of the response that made Ashford's hands shake. Brandt had a younger brother, Heinrich, who'd been recruited into the Abwehr in 1936. Heinrich Brandt was a specialist in deep cover operations, trained to assume false identities and disappear into civilian populations for years at a time. The attached photograph showed a man with deep-set eyes and a stern face. Thomas Pemberton. My God, Walsh whispered, looking over her shoulder. He's been here for 12 years. Waiting. Not waiting, Ashford corrected, her voice hollow. Preparing. They placed him there more than a decade ago, long before anyone could have predicted this war. They knew that Lighthouse would be valuable, and they made sure they had someone in position when the time came. But even as she spoke, Ashford realized there was something worse lurking beneath this revelation. If Heinrich Brandt had been the lighthouse keeper, if he'd guided those U-boats to the convoy, then he'd broken cover, exposed an asset that had taken years to place. No intelligence service abandons a perfectly positioned agent like that unless the stakes are catastrophically high. He's still out there, Ashford said. And whatever he's planning, the convoy was just the beginning. The next morning, they found the hidden radio transmitter buried beneath the lighthouse's foundation, wrapped in oilcloth. It was top-of-the-line German military equipment, with a range of over 500 miles. But what terrified them most was the notebook they found with it, filled with coded coordinates and dates, convoy routes, ship movements, naval deployments. The dates went back 3 years, and the most recent entry was dated 2 days ago, 4 days after the convoy attack, which meant that Heinrich Brandt, the man who'd orchestrated the deaths of 312 sailors, was still transmitting, still operational, still hunting. Part 3. The Hunter Becomes Prey. Commander Ashford stared at the decoded notebook until her eyes burned. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight. Every convoy that Heinrich Brandt had reported, 17 in total over 3 years, had been attacked within 48 hours. But 6 of those convoys had reached their destinations safely despite U-boat attacks. Why? She muttered, spreading the maps across the table. Why did some get through? Walsh pointed to the coordinates. Different routes, ma'am. The ones that survived all deviated from their planned courses due to weather or someone warned them, Ashford interrupted, her pulse quickening. She grabbed the naval communication logs and began cross-referencing. Walsh, get me every signal sent to these 6 convoys. Every single one. 3 hours later, they had their answer. Each of the 6 surviving convoys had received last-minute course changes based on updated intelligence about U-boat positions. The signals had come from Naval Intelligence Headquarters, from a department that Commander Elizabeth Ashford ran. Someone inside Naval Intelligence is working with Brandt, she said, the words tasting like poison. They've been feeding him convoy routes, and he's been passing them to the Germans. But occasionally, they save a convoy to avoid suspicion to make it look like our intelligence network is working. Walsh's face went pale. Ma'am, It means there's a traitor in London, someone with access to the highest levels of naval operations. Ashford felt the walls closing in. And it means Brandt isn't just a spy. He's part of a network. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The mysterious figure watching from the lighthouse window, the fresh tobacco smoke. Brandt hadn't been alone that night. The transmissions after the attack, Ashford said urgently. Where were they sent? Walsh checked his notes. The signals were directional. Aim northeast. We traced the likely recipient to somewhere in Scotland or northern England, but get me a list of every naval intelligence officer who was on leave or away from London in the 72 hours following the convoy attack. The list came back with 8 names. Ashford's heart sank when she saw the 3rd name on the list, Captain Richard Thornton, her mentor. The man who'd recruited her into naval intelligence 5 years ago. The man who had personally assigned her to this investigation. No, she whispered. But even as she denied it, the evidence crystallized. Thornton had access to everything. He'd been the one pushing for Lighthouse decommissioning in 1940, which meant he'd known Brandt needed darkness to operate effectively. He'd been on holiday in the Lake District the week before the convoy sailed, plenty of time to meet with contacts and finalize the ambush. And he'd sent Ashford to investigate, confident that she'd never suspect him. Walsh was reading the same dossier, his face ashen. Captain Thornton was in Scotland 3 days after the attack. He filed a report claiming he was inspecting coastal defenses, but there's no record of Claude. The door burst open. Captain Richard Thornton himself stood in the doorway, his face grave. "Commander Ashford, I need to speak with you, privately, now." Ashford's hand moved slowly toward the service revolver on her desk. "I think we should speak right here, sir," with Lieutenant Walsh present. Thornton's eyes flickered to the maps, the decoded notebook, the evidence spread across the table. Something shifted in his expression, a mask dropping away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "You always were too clever for your own good, Elizabeth," he said quietly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I told them you were the wrong choice for this investigation." "Told who?" Ashford's fingers closed around the revolver grip. "The people who understand that this war is already lost," Thornton said. "Britain is bleeding to death in the Atlantic. Germany will win. It's only a matter of time. Some of us have chosen to be on the winning side. 312 men died because of you," Ashford said, her voice shaking with rage. "British sailors. Our people." "Acceptable losses in service of the greater good," Thornton replied. "The new order will—" He never finished the sentence. Walsh, who'd been slowly circling behind him, brought a paperweight down on the back of Thornton's skull. The captain crumpled, without a sound. "Sir?" Walsh looked at the unconscious man, then at Ashford. "What do we do now?" "Now?" Ashford holstered her weapon and grabbed her coat. "Now we find Heinrich Brandt before he disappears forever. Because if Thornton knew we'd figured it out, then Brandt knows too." They found the safe house 3 days later, abandoned fishing cottage on the coast of Northumberland. The local constable remembered seeing lights there 2 weeks ago, which was impossible because the cottage had been empty for years. Ashford approached in the pre-dawn darkness, her small team of trusted Marines fanning out around the building. Rain hammered down, turning the coastal path into a river of mud. Through the window, she could see a single candle burning. Someone was home. Naval intelligence. Ashford kicked in the door, revolver raised. "Nobody move." The room was empty except for a single chair facing the window. And sitting in that chair, looking out at the gray Atlantic as if he'd been waiting for her, was a man with deep-set eyes and a stern face. Heinrich Brandt didn't turn around. "Commander Ashford," he said in perfect English, tinged with the slightest German accent, "I've been expecting you. Please, sit down. We have very little time. You're under arrest for espionage and the murder of 312 sailors." "Yes, I know." Brandt finally turned to face her. His eyes were hollow, haunted. "Do you want to know something terrible, Commander? I remember every single one of their names." Ashford faltered. This wasn't the cold-blooded killer she'd been expecting. "I had their convoy manifests," Brandt continued, his voice breaking. "I read every name before I sent the signal. I wanted to know who I was killing." Michael Patterson, 19, from Liverpool. James Chen, 32, from Cardiff. Thomas. His voice caught. Thomas Morrison, Jr., 17, the captain's son. He wasn't supposed to be on that ship. Last-minute assignment. "Then why?" Ashford demanded. "Why did you do it?" Brandt reached slowly into his jacket. Ashford's Marines raised their weapons and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the table. A woman and 2 small children, smiling in summer sunlight. "My wife, Anna, my daughters, Sophie, and Clara. They're in Berlin." Brandt's hands trembled. "The Gestapo came for them in 1941. They said if I didn't continue my mission, my family would be sent to a camp in Poland, a place called Auschwitz. Do you know what happens in those camps, Commander?" Ashford felt sick. "You're asking me to sympathize with you?" "No," Brandt said. "I'm asking you to understand. I've been Thomas Pemberton for so long I'd almost forgotten who I really was. I tended that lighthouse for 12 years. I rescued drowning sailors. I guided ships safely through storms. And then the war came, and my handlers activated me, and I became a murderer to save my children." He stood slowly, hands raised. "But here's what you need to know, Commander. The convoy wasn't the real target. It was never about the convoy." "What are you talking about?" "There's another operation, something catastrophic. They used me as a distraction to draw attention away from the real plan." Brant's eyes locked onto hers with desperate intensity. "In 6 days, there's a convoy sailing from New York. Convoy HX 234. It's carrying something the Germans want very badly. Thornton arranged for the route to be passed directly to Admiral Donitz himself." "What's on that convoy?" "Scientists," Brant whispered. "Nuclear physicists being evacuated from America to Canada. The brightest minds working on atomic research. If the Germans capture them, he didn't need to finish." Ashford's blood ran cold. "How many U-boats?" "Every submarine that can be spared. 30, maybe more. The entire wolf pack." Brant pulled out a folded map with coordinates. "This is where they'll strike. I was ordered to transmit final confirmation tomorrow night. If I don't, they'll know something's wrong and abort. But if you use my radio, if you send false coordinates, we could lead them into a trap," Ashford breathed. "Yes." Brant slumped back into his chair. "It's the only way I can even begin to atone for what I've done. Those 312 men, their deaths have to mean something." Ashford studied the broken spy before her. "Why should I trust you?" Brant pulled out a pistol. The Marines surged forward, but Ashford raised her hand, stopping them. The German placed the weapon on the table, pointing it toward himself. "Because, Commander, I stopped caring whether I live or die the moment I lit that lighthouse." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I just want to save some lives before the end. Maybe then God will let me see my daughters again. If they're even still alive." The room fell silent except for the rain hammering against the windows and the distant cry of seagulls greeting the dawn. Ashford made her decision. "Lieutenant Walsh, set up Brant's radio. We have a transmission to send. Part 4. Atonement in deep water. The North Atlantic, 6 days later." The trap was set. Heinrich Brandt had transmitted the false coordinates exactly as instructed, informing Admiral Donitz that Convoy HX 234 would pass through a specific grid square 400 miles northeast of its actual route. The real convoy, with its precious cargo of nuclear scientists, had been diverted to a heavily defended corridor, escorted by 3 destroyers and air cover from Iceland. But the false coordinates? Those led to a killing ground. Commander Ashford stood on the bridge of HMS Revenge, a battleship positioned at the center of the largest anti-submarine operation of the war. Surrounding them were 8 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 2 escort carriers, with Swordfish torpedo bombers ready for launch. Beneath the gray water, sonar operators listened for the telltale sound of diesel engines. And standing beside Ashford, hands bound but otherwise unrestrained, was Heinrich Brandt. "They'll be here," he said quietly, staring at the horizon. "Donitz committed everything to this operation. He believes capturing those scientists will win Germany the war." "You could have warned them," Ashford said. "Sent a coded message in your transmission. Why didn't you?" Brandt was silent for a long moment. "Because I'm tired of choosing which innocent people live and which ones die. For once, I wanted to save everyone." He paused. "Well, everyone, except the ones who deserve what's coming." The sonar contact came at 14:27 hours. "Multiple contacts bearing 270 degrees, the operator called out. "Estimate 20-plus submarines in Wolfpack formation." "Battle stations." The captain's voice boomed across the ship. "Launch aircraft. All escorts commenced depth charge patterns." What followed was carnage on a scale the U-boat fleet had never experienced. The German submarines, expecting defenseless merchant ships, sailed directly into a naval ambush. Depth charges turned the ocean into a boiling cauldron. Torpedoes from the Swordfish bombers found their marks with devastating accuracy. U-437, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, the man who'd fired the first torpedo at Convoy HX 229 amperes, was the first to die. A depth charge broke her back, sending her spiraling into the abyss with all hands. One by one, the U-boats were hunted down. Some tried to surrender, surfacing with white flags. Others fought to the end, their crews knowing that capture meant execution for war crimes. The battle lasted 8 hours. When silence finally fell, 17 German submarines lay on the ocean floor. 9 had been captured. 4 had escaped into the Atlantic darkness. Over 800 German sailors were dead or captured. British losses: 12 men wounded. No ship sunk. Brandt watched it all with the expression of a man witnessing his own execution. "Those are boys down there," he whispered. 18, 19 years old. Most of them don't even understand why they're fighting. He turned to Ashford. "I've killed so many people, Commander. On both sides. When does it end?" "When monsters stop forcing good people to make impossible choices," Ashford replied. That night, in the captain's quarters, Ashford received 2 communications that would change everything. The first was from Naval Intelligence. Captain Richard Thornton had been found dead in his cell, apparent suicide, though the investigation was ongoing. But before he died, he'd confessed to everything, naming 12 other members of the spy ring operating within British intelligence and military command. The network was being rolled up even as she read the report. The second communication was from the Red Cross, forwarded through MI6 channels. Anna Brandt and her 2 daughters had been located in a displaced persons camp in Sweden. They'd escaped Germany 3 months ago with the help of resistance fighters. They were alive, malnourished, traumatized, but alive. Ashford found Brandt on the deck, staring at the stars. "Your family," she said quietly. "They're safe. They made it to Sweden." "And way." Brandt's knees buckled. He collapsed against the railing, a sound escaping his throat that was half sob, half laugh. "They're alive? You're certain?" The Red Cross confirmed it. "Your wife and both daughters." For several minutes, Brandt couldn't speak. He simply stood there, shaking, tears streaming down his face. When he finally found his voice, it was barely a whisper. "All of it was for nothing. Then, they were already safe when I lit the lighthouse. They work when I lit the lighthouse." "You couldn't have known," Ashford said. "Does it matter?" Brandt looked at her with eyes full of anguish. 312 men are still dead. I still murdered them. The fact that my family was already safe just makes it worse, don't you see? I betrayed my conscience for a threat that no longer existed. Ashford had no answer for that. The military tribunal took place 3 weeks later in a secure facility in London. The proceedings were classified at the highest level. The British government wanted no public knowledge of how deeply German intelligence had penetrated their military command. Heinrich Brandt pleaded guilty to all charges. He refused legal representation. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he stood and spoke for 20 minutes. Naming every sailor who died in the convoy attack. Every single name, from memory. "I don't ask for mercy," he concluded. "I ask only that you tell their families that someone remembered them, that someone knew their names." The sentence was death by firing squad. But Commander Elizabeth Ashford, now promoted to captain for her role in dismantling the spy ring, had one final card to play. She'd spent 3 weeks calling in every favor, navigating every channel of bureaucracy, arguing with generals and politicians. On the morning of Brandt's scheduled execution, she entered his cell with a folder. "You have a choice," she said. "You can face the firing squad, or you can accept this." She handed him the documents. A death certificate for Heinrich Brandt, executed by firing squad. A new identity. Thomas Keller, Austrian refugee, cleared by MI5. And a photograph of a small cottage in the Canadian countryside, not far from where his family was being relocated. "I can't just..." Brandt stared at the papers in disbelief. "Why would you do this?" "Because you're not the monster, Brandt. You're the victim. The Nazis made you a weapon and aimed you at innocent people. Yes, you pulled the trigger, but they loaded the gun. Ashford leaned forward. "And because you saved Convoy HX 234, those nuclear scientists are now safely in Canada, working on projects that might actually end this war. You saved them. That has to count for something. The families of the men I killed will never know you lived." As far as history is concerned, Heinrich Brandt died 3 weeks ago. But Thomas Keller? He's going to live quietly in Canada, work an ordinary job, raise his daughters, and spend the rest of his life trying to be a good man. That's your sentence. Not death, life. Living with what you've done. And trying to balance the scales. Brandt's hands trembled as he held the documents. "I don't deserve this." "No," Ashford agreed. "You don't. But your daughters deserve a father, and your wife deserves her husband back. And maybe, just maybe, the world has had enough death for one more." 3 months later, a lighthouse keeper named Thomas Keller began working at a small automated station on the Canadian coast near Nova Scotia. He lived in a cottage with his wife and 2 daughters. He rescued drowning sailors, guided ships through storms, and every night, before sleep, he recited a list of names, 312 names. He would recite that list every night for the next 43 years, until the day he died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. In his final moments, witnesses said he smiled and whispered, "I hope that was enough. I hope I saved enough." His wife found the notebook after his death, the one where he'd written every name, along with what he'd been able to learn about each sailor, their ages, their families, their dreams. And beside each name, he'd written one word, over and over: "Sorry." Captain Elizabeth Ashford attended the funeral, traveling from London under a false name. She placed a small stone on the grave, a Jewish tradition she'd learned from one of the families of the lost sailors. "You didn't save enough," she whispered to the headstone. "No one could have, but you tried. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can do." As she walked away, she passed a young woman who stood crying beside the grave. Sophie Keller, now Sophie Morrison, married to the grandson of Captain James Morrison of HMS Steadfast. Life had a strange way of drawing circles, connecting the survivors of tragedy in unexpected ways. The story of the lighthouse that betrayed a convoy remained classified for 50 years. The lighthouse at Street Kieran's Rock, abandoned since 1941, had been destroyed in a storm in 1944. But local fishermen reported seeing lights from that location on 17 different nights between 1945 and 1950 nights when convoys were passing nearby, nights when storms threatened. The Admiralty investigated but found nothing. The lighthouse was ruins. The light mechanism had been removed. There was no possible way for anyone to light the beacon. Yet the fishermen insisted. On nights when ships were in danger, the lighthouse burned. Perhaps it was atmospheric phenomena. Perhaps it was collective delusion. Perhaps it was simply the guilt and grief of a nation that had lost too many sailors to an unforgiving sea. Or perhaps it was the ghost of a man who spent the rest of his life, and whatever came after, trying to guide ships safely home. The beacon at Street Kieran's Rock never burns now. The ruins stand silent on their lonely rock, waves crashing against the stone, seabirds wheeling overhead. But on certain nights, when fog rolls in from the Atlantic and the wind howls like a chorus of the damned, people swear they can still see it. A light in the darkness. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. Not a distress call anymore. A warning. A remembrance, a prayer.